The Velkari ambassador had been speaking for 11 minutes, and she had not once looked at the human seated across the table. That was fine. Sergeant Major Dara Osai had spent 22 years being looked through, around, and occasionally over. A black woman from Kumasi who had clawed her way up through the Unified Earth Defense Corps by being twice as good at everything she was allowed to do and pretending not to notice when she was excluded from the things she wasn't. She was accustomed to invisibility. She had learned to make it useful. So while the ambassador addressed her remarks exclusively to General Holt, who sat at Dara's left, and while the three Velkari diplomatic aides arranged themselves in a perfect triad behind their principal and breathed in practiced, synchronized waves, Dara watched. She catalogued. She counted the tiny muscular contractions in the ambassador's secondary throat sac when she shifted between their language and the translated standard. She noted the way the nearest aide's color chromatophores flushed toward yellow when Dara shifted her weight in her chair, stress response maybe, or aggression, or just light hitting the fabric differently. She didn't know yet. She had been on Velkar for 4 days. She was still learning to read them. The conclave's position, Ambassador Saravath was saying, her translated standard emerging from a small box on the table that converted her sub-bass harmonics into something human ears could parse, is that the rift cannot be permitted to expand. We have contained it for 6 of your centuries. We will contain it for 6 more. The question of what role, if any, the human species might play in this effort is. She paused. The pause had the quality of something deliberate, something rehearsed. Under consideration. General Holt cleared his throat. He was a careful man, balancing things on both sides of a scale at all times. The UEDC appreciates the conclave's long stewardship of the rift. Earth's scientific community believes it represents. What your scientists believe about the rift, Saravath said, still without looking at Dara, is charming. The room was silent for a moment. Dara kept her face exactly neutral. The ambassador's aide, the yellow flushing one, glanced at Dara then, briefly. Something in that glance was not diplomatic. It was the look someone gives a piece of furniture they expect will soon need to be moved. Holt pressed forward. He was too careful a man to let the silence calcify. The UEDC's request is straightforward: joint access to rift monitoring stations within the contested belt. We have geologists, astrophysicists, materials engineers who believe they can contribute. Humans, Saravath said, do not contribute to rift containment. Humans observe. Humans record. Humans occasionally embarrass themselves and need to be collected from the debris fields where their curiosity led them. She turned her head finally and looked directly at Dara. Her eyes were compound, fractured into dozens of facets, each one a different shade of dark violet. They caught light in a way that made it difficult to read emotion in them, which Dara suspected was perfectly intentional. Is this not so, Sergeant Major? Dara met her gaze. She said nothing for 2 full seconds, which she knew would read as a hesitation. She was using those 2 seconds to decide exactly what to do with the next 30 seconds. She smiled, not the polished diplomatic smile. The other one, the one her recruits had described over the years as mildly alarming. It is so, she said. We're very good at getting into trouble. We're also very good at getting out of it. Saravath's secondary throat sac pulsed. You misunderstand me. I did not offer that as a compliment. I know, Dara said. Neither did I. The rift was not a wound in space. Exactly. Though that was how the human science press had taken to describing it. It was something older and less dramatic than that. It was a boundary condition, a place where the physics of one region of the galaxy declined to cooperate with the physics of another, where local spacetime had a chronic disagreement with itself that expressed in ways ranging from navigational anomalies to catastrophic matter dissolution, depending on how close you got and on what day. The Velkari had been managing that boundary for 600 of Earth's years. They had 17 monitoring stations along what they called the inner hem, a roughly ovoid region of space several hundred light-years from edge to edge, within which the rift's more dramatic effects could still be felt, measured, and occasionally contained. They had a whole bureaucratic apparatus for it, a ministry, a priesthood, an ancient and elaborate tradition of young Velkari dedicants who spent their lives in proximity to the rift, reading its signals, mapping its behavior, feeding data to a central analysis system that had been running continuously since before the American continent had a printing press. They were, by any measure, the foremost experts on the rift that existed. They had also, according to the 4 separate briefings Dara had attended before boarding the transport, been steadily losing ground on containment for the past 60 years. The rift was growing, slowly, almost imperceptibly slowly by the scale of galactic events. But the math, run on UEDC modeling systems and confirmed independently by 3 Velkari scientists who had quietly shared data with a human astrophysicist during a conference 9 months ago, was unambiguous. At the current rate, in approximately 400 years, the inner hem would begin to destabilize. In 600, the Velkari homeworld would be inside it. In 1000, the edge of human space would reach the boundary. None of this was in the official Velkari communications to Earth. Saravath certainly hadn't mentioned it, but it was in the briefings, and Dara had read the briefings 3 times. She thought about this as she stood at the window of her assigned quarters, a spare, austere room in the diplomatic compound, the furniture scaled for Velkari proportions, and therefore subtly wrong for a human body in ways that accumulated slowly into discomfort, and watched the moons rise over the capital city of Velshar. There were 4 moons, arranged in a conjunction that apparently occurred once every 22 years and was considered sacred. The city below had its lights dimmed for the occasion. In the near dark, the architecture of Velshar resolved into something more beautiful than it appeared in daylight. Curved towers of grown stone that the Velkari cultivated over generations, their surfaces iridescent where they caught the moonlight, the whole city arranged in the shape of a spiral when seen from above, because the Velkari navigated by resonance as much as by sight, and a spiral was a naturally resonant form. It was extraordinary. Dara allowed herself that privately before returning to the problem. The problem was this: Earth wanted a seat at the table. The Velkari did not want to offer one. The Velkari were running out of time without knowing they were running out of time, or knowing and refusing to admit it, which came to much the same thing strategically. And Dara had been sent here, ostensibly as part of the diplomatic escort, her rank serving as window dressing to imply UEDC was taking this seriously. Because someone in the diplomatic corps had decided that having a soldier in the room might be useful, though they had been careful not to specify useful for what. She had a guess. She did not particularly like her guess. Her door announced a visitor at 1:40 station time, which was a peculiar hour for a social call. She opened it to find the yellow flushing aide, whose name, she had learned during the welcome reception, was Velshari Imathi, second Imathi of the dedicants of the inner hem, standing in the corridor with the posture of someone who had considered not coming and had come anyway. "Sergeant Major," Imathi said. Her translated standard was cleaner than Saravath's, the box at her collar calibrated better. "Velshari Imathi," Dara said. "Do you want to come in or would you rather the corridor?" A pause. "The corridor is less appropriate for what I need to say." "Come in then." Dara stepped back. Imathi entered and stood in the center of the room. It was her native scale. The furniture was right for her, and looked at Dara with those fractured violet eyes, chromatophores steady at a pale silver that Dara associated, from 4 days of observation, with either neutrality or something trying to look like neutrality. "You were not insulted today," Imathi said. "The ambassador said something deliberately diminishing, and you were not insulted." "I was," Dara said. "I just didn't show it." "Why?" Because being insulted in a negotiation is information about you, not about the person who insulted you. And I didn't want to give information away. Imatha's chromatophores flickered briefly orange, then back to silver. You are unexpected, she said. I've been told that. The UEDC briefing that preceded your delegation's arrival described you as General Holt's security officer. It implied you would stand behind him and look large. I'm not particularly large, Dara said. No, Imatha agreed. But you watch everything, the ambassador noticed. She found it irritating. I found it. The chromatophores flickered again. I have been a dedicant of the inner hymn for 19 years. I read data. I map anomalies. I notice things that are not in the expected pattern. You are not in the expected pattern. Dara said nothing. She waited. There is a situation, Imatha said. It is not one that the ambassador would authorize me to discuss with you. I am discussing it with you anyway because I have been out to the hymn twice in the last year, and both times the monitors read things that our models could not account for. And I do not have the mathematical tools to tell the conclave what those readings mean, only that they are significant, and that significant is not a good description for something near the rift to be. What kind of readings? Dara asked. Her voice was level, her pulse was not. Harmonic interference patterns on a submetric scale. The rift is generating a resonance that our containment arrays were not designed to absorb. It is, Imatha started again. Imagine a wall that has been holding water back for 600 years. The wall has small cracks. This is known. This has always been managed. But now something is pressing against the other side of the wall, not pushing it down, pressing. The pressure is rhythmic, patient, like something with intent. The room was very quiet. You came to tell me this, Dara said, at 1:40 without the ambassador's knowledge because your scientists published a paper 14 months ago, Imatha said. A human scientist named Dr. Priya Venkataraman at the Madurai Institute for Xenophysics. She described a theoretical model of something she called structured interference resonance. The possibility that certain rift anomalies might not be passive physics events, but could represent a pattern generated by a third party. Dara knew about the Venkataraman paper. She had read it on the transport. You think something is on the other side of the rift, she said, not a question. Imatha's chromatophores went flat white. The conclave does not think this. The conclave thinks the rift is a boundary condition experiencing secular drift. The conclave thinks the human suggestion that we allow joint access to our monitoring stations is an opportunistic land grab dressed up in scientific language. Another pause. 3 of our dedicants have reported hearing sounds during their monitoring sessions. Sounds that the equipment does not record, but that multiple individuals describe in strikingly similar terms. What do they describe? A rhythm, Imatha said. A pulse. The way you might hear a heartbeat through a wall if you pressed your ear against the stone and were very, very quiet. General Holt did not love being woken at 2:10 for a conversation that began with the words, I think Velshori Imatha is trying to go around her own ambassador. But he was a soldier, and soldiers learned to function in the hours the clock described as unreasonable. He sat in the common room of the diplomatic suite with his uniform jacket over his sleep clothes and his reading glasses on and listened, while Dara laid out the conversation precisely, without editorializing, the way she'd been taught in the first week of the intelligence attachment training that she'd done 17 years ago and used in approximately 3 prior postings. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She's a rogue actor within her own delegation, he said. Maybe. Or she's a person who has data she can't get her leadership to take seriously and is looking for someone who might. Same thing could be true, and the data could still be wrong. Yes, sir. Or she could be running a test on us, seeing what we do with unauthorized contact. Also possible, Dara said. but her chromatophores went flat white when she described the sound. "I've been watching them for 4 days. That's the first time I've seen that shade. I don't know their whole emotional vocabulary yet, but I know involuntary responses. That wasn't a performance." Holt took his glasses off and cleaned them on his jacket hem, which he did when he was thinking, and didn't want to show that he was thinking. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to see the monitoring stations," Dara said. "Not through official channels. If we request access through Saravath, she'll refuse and we'll have put Imathy at risk for nothing. I want to ask Imathy directly if she can get us out there. Me and one science officer. Small footprint." "That's outside your mandate." "It is, sir. I'm aware. If this goes wrong, the Conclave will use it to justify excluding us entirely. We'll lose the diplomatic track. If something is on the other side of the rift and we don't find out what it is," Dara said, "there may not be a diplomatic track to lose." Holt put his glasses back on, looked at her over the top of them. "You've been thinking about this since before we landed," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the briefings," she admitted. "The Velkari have been losing ground on containment for 60 years. They've been doing the same thing for 6 centuries. At some point, doing the same thing stops working, and the only way to do something different is to have a different perspective in the room. And you think that's us?" "I think that's what we're for, yes. I think that's always been what we're for, and that we tend to figure it out late." The general looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "I'll give you 72 hours. If you're not back with something concrete, I recall you and we proceed through official channels. And Os," he said her name like a period at the end of a sentence, "don't get us expelled from this system." "I'll do my best," she said. The science officer they had brought was Dr. Layla Farrock, 31 years old, attached to the UEDC from the Tehran Institute of Cosmological Studies. And the reason she was on this particular diplomatic mission was that she had read the Venkataraman paper, and then independently developed a mathematical extension of it that Venkataraman herself had described in an email as annoyingly elegant. Farrock was also the most frightened person Dara had ever agreed to take into a dangerous situation, which was saying something because Dara had spent 3 tours in conflict zones with people who were scared but functional. Farrock was scared and functional. She was also terrified and meticulous, and the kind of person who, when told they would be making an unauthorized trip to a restricted monitoring station near the most dangerous boundary condition in local space, immediately started running calculations on her tablet and asking quietly specific questions. "The harmonic interference pattern Imathy described," she said, as their transport, an unmarked Velkari shuttle Imathy had borrowed on a pretext that Dara had deliberately not asked about, cleared the outer limits of the capital and entered the transit corridor to the inner hem. "I've been trying to fit it to my extension of Venkataraman's model. If I'm right about the mathematics, the pattern isn't random and it isn't natural rift behavior. It's generative." "Explain generative," Dara said. "Something is generating it. On purpose. The rift acts like a membrane, right? Information can pass through it under certain conditions. What we might be seeing is something on the far side that has figured out how to use the rift as a communication medium." "Communication," Imathy said from the pilot's seat. Her translated standard was thoughtful. "The Conclave considered this possibility when the first anomalous readings appeared. They concluded it was an anthropocentric bias, the assumption that unusual behavior implies intent, intelligence." "Maybe," Farrock said, "but your dedicants are hearing a pulse, a rhythm. That's not how random interference sounds. Random interference sounds like noise. A rhythm is." "A heartbeat," Dara said, remembering Imathy's word. "Or a signal," Farrock said, "or both." The transit corridor to the inner hem took 11 hours. Dara spent 4 of them sleeping in the rear compartment because she had learned early that sleep was a resource and wasting it on anxiety was poor logistics. She spent the other 7 watching Emathi and Farok talk. It was something to watch. They had no language in common except Standard, which both of them spoke with visible effort. It was nobody's native tongue. And yet within 2 hours they had developed the kind of shorthand that Dara associated with people who were thinking at the same level about the same problem. Farok would sketch something on her tablet and hold it up, and Ematha's chromatophores would shift to convey her response before she found the words. Emathi would describe a monitoring pattern using 3-part Velkari spatial notation, and Farok would nod before the translation finished. There was something in that, something human, something Dara had seen in 100 different configurations over 22 years. The moment when 2 people who approach the world very differently realize they are looking at the same thing. It was a specific kind of trust, fast and fragile and almost always true. She hoped it would be enough. Station Hem 7 was the outermost of the 17 monitoring posts along the inner hem. It was also, Emathi explained, with the flat-toned specificity of someone reciting a fact they found personally uncomfortable, the station that had produced the most anomalous readings over the past 20 months. It was staffed by a crew of 3 dedicants who had been there for 14 months and were not due for rotation for another 6. The station itself was smaller than Dara had expected. It was a grown stone structure, like the city towers but more spare, more functional, anchored to a fragment of rock that had no particular name in the Velkari catalog, just a coordinate reference. It looked in the approach like someone had cultivated a barnacle on a cinder block and then filled the barnacle with sensitive equipment. The crew met them at the docking port with the polite wariness of people who hadn't had visitors in a long time and weren't sure what to do with them. Their names, translated into something Dara's tongue could manage, were Risha, Tal, and the one who they called Quiet. Quiet had been called that, Risha explained with the Velkari equivalent of a shrug, since before she was assigned to the station, because she had a way of being present without being noticed. It was meant as a compliment. Dara found she liked Quiet immediately. Quiet was the one who had first reported hearing the pulse. "I want to understand what you heard," Dara told her, once the introductions were complete and Farok had disappeared into the monitoring room with Emathi and the equipment, her tablet already producing numbers. "Not the technical description. What you experienced." Quiet looked at her with those compound violet eyes for a long moment. Her chromatophores were a deep, steady amber that Dara had started to associate with something like solemnity. "I was running the overnight sequence check," Quiet said. "This is routine. I have done it 231 times at this station. The equipment produces a baseline reading and I compare it against the previous cycle for drift." She paused. "On this night the equipment was running normally. I was making comparisons. And then I heard," she stopped. "Take your time," Dara said. "I heard myself," Quiet said. "That is the only way I can describe it. Not my voice, not my thoughts, but the shape of myself, the rhythm of the way I pay attention. I heard it coming from the other direction, from beyond the hem, as though something on the far side had been listening to me for a very long time and had finally decided to reflect what it heard back." Dara said very carefully, "You think something knew you were there." "I think something knew I was paying attention," Quiet said. "And I think it wanted me to know that it was paying attention too." The monitoring room was a cramped space full of equipment that Dara couldn't read, but that Farok was reading with the focused intensity of a person who has just found a thing they have been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. Emathi stood beside her, and their conversation was rapid and technical and punctuated by moments where Farok would go completely still, and then write something down with the handwriting of someone whose pen is barely keeping up with their brain. Dara stood in the doorway and watched them and waited. 40 minutes in, Farok looked up. "It's not structured interference," she said. "I was wrong about that. It's more sophisticated than that." She set her tablet down on the nearest flat surface and rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. It's encoding. The resonance pattern isn't just rhythmic, it has a mathematical structure that recurs on multiple scales simultaneously. That's not a physics accident. That's not a naturally occurring boundary phenomenon. She looked at Imathy. Your containment arrays have been absorbing this for how long? The pattern first appeared in our records 23 months ago, Imathy said. Although when I ran a deep retrospective on the archived data, she hesitated. I found earlier precursors, fainter versions of the same structure, going back approximately 6 years. 6 years, Farrokh said. Something has been trying to communicate through the rift for 6 years and nobody, she stopped herself, recalibrated. Okay. The question isn't why nobody noticed sooner. The question is whether we can decode it. Can you? Dara asked from the doorway. I can try, Farrokh said. I'm going to need time. I'm going to need access to the full 23 months of high-resolution sensor data. And I'm going to need to stop being impressed by what I'm looking at, because right now I'm extremely impressed, and that is making it difficult to think. How much time? Dara said. Days, Farrokh said. Realistically, I'm sorry, I know you have. Take what you need, Dara said. She looked at Imathy. Can we stay here without triggering an official inquiry? For some time, Imathy said. I am a senior dedicant. My movements are logged but not scrutinized. If the station crew, she looked at Risha, who had appeared in the doorway behind Dara, are cooperative. We are cooperative, Risha said quietly. Then we have perhaps 5 days before my absence becomes a problem. 5 days, Dara said. All right. On the second day, the pulse changed. Farrokh was in the monitoring room at 3:40. She had taken to working in 4-hour blocks with 2-hour rests, the kind of schedule that would have worried Dara in a long deployment, but that Farrokh described as how I do things when things are interesting. And Dara was awake in the common room with a mug of something warm that was the closest the station's food supply came to tea, when every piece of monitoring equipment in the station produced an alert at the same moment. Dara was in the monitoring room before the second alert could sound. The readings on the central display were unlike anything that had been on the screen before, not more of the same pattern, something new. Something that incorporated the mathematical structure Farrokh had been mapping, but added a dimension to it, the way a melody adds a harmony. That's a response, Farrokh said. Her voice was very quiet. To what I've been doing, to me analyzing the pattern. Something on the other side just noticed that I was analyzing it and she swallowed, and changed what it was sending. The room was very still. It changed the signal, Dara said, in response to you. In response to me trying to decode it, yes, as though, Farrokh stopped, tried again. When you learn someone's language, she said, you talk to them differently than you talk to someone who doesn't know your language. You use less shorthand. You use different vocabulary, more foundational. She looked at the screen. This new pattern is more foundational. It's doing the same thing, encoding mathematical structure across multiple scales, but the base unit is simpler, like it simplified itself for me. Quiet was standing in the doorway of the monitoring room. Her chromatophores were flat white, the same shade Imathy had gone when she described the sound in Dara's quarters. It is teaching us, Quiet said. Nobody disagreed. On the third day, Dara sent a message to General Holt on a tight beam encrypted channel, bypassing the standard diplomatic relay. The message was brief. She described the situation in factual terms, the pattern, Farrokh's analysis, the shift in the signal. She did not speculate about implications. She asked for an extension of her operational window. Holt replied in 6 hours. One sentence, you have 10 days. Don't make me regret this. On the fourth day, Saravath contacted Imathy through official channels requesting her immediate return to the capital for an unspecified briefing. Imathy responded that she was conducting a field review of anomalous monitoring data at HEM 7, and would return when the review was complete. There was a long pause in the official channels after that. Dara read it as someone deciding what to do about an insubordinate junior officer who was technically within the scope of her duties. On the fifth day, Farrock cracked the base in coding. She came out of the monitoring room at 1700 station time with red eyes, and a look on her face that Dara had seen on people who have just seen something they will never be able to unsee. And she sat down on the floor of the common room, not in a chair, on the floor, cross-legged, because apparently her legs had stopped supporting her opinion, and said, "I know what it's saying." Dara sat down across from her, not in a chair either, on the floor. "Tell me," she said. "It's giving us measurements," Farrock said. "Spatial measurements, distances, sizes, expressed in units that are, I've been working backward from context to figure out the base units, expressed in wavelengths of a specific frequency of radiation that can pass through the rift, which is smart, actually, really smart. Because that frequency is a constant on both sides of the rift, universal physical constant. So anyone who encounters the encoding can determine the base unit by detecting that frequency. It's a self-contained measurement system." She stopped, continued. "The measurements describe a volume, a space, a specific location in space relative to the rift boundary measured from the far side." "A location," Dara said. "What's at that location?" Farrock looked at her. "A point on the rift boundary, a specific point, a point where the rift membrane is, apparently," she checked her tablet, "thinner, less energetically costly to breach. A natural passage point if such a thing can be made to function." "They're telling us where a door is," Dara said. "They're telling us where a door is," Farrock confirmed. "And that's not all. The second half of the encoding, the part I've spent the last 30 hours on, is harder, more abstract. It's not measurements, it's," she closed her eyes, opened them. "It's a description of conditions, physical conditions, radiation levels, gravitational parameters, atmospheric data expressed in terms of those same universal constants. And the conditions described are," she paused, "they're compatible with biological life. The kind of life we're familiar with. Not identical to Earth conditions, but within survivable range for an unshielded human being." The room was silent. "Something on the far side of the rift," Dara said, "is telling us there is a passable point in the membrane, and that on the other side of that point, conditions support life." "Something on the far side of the rift is telling us," Farrock said, "that it wants us to come through." Imathi came to find Dara an hour later. She had been in the monitoring room going over Farrock's work. Farrock had left her the raw analysis, and the derivations, open, organized, the way someone leaves a room unlocked for someone they trust, and she had the expression of a person who has had a belief, confirmed that they had not previously allowed themselves to fully believe. "The conclave will not move on this," Imathi said. "Not quickly, not without deliberation that takes months, possibly years. The process is," she made a gesture with her secondary limbs that the translation box couldn't parse, but that Dara read as frustrated. "The conclave maintains the rift. They have maintained it for 6 centuries. The idea that they should now respond to something from the rift, that the relationship should become, in some sense, bilateral, is not a concept they will accept easily." "But the rift is growing," Dara said. "Slowly. And something on the other side is losing patience, or building towards something, or," Dara stopped, "or the thing it's been trying to do for 6 years is stabilize the rift from the far side, and it can't do it alone, and it's telling us where to show up." Imathi's chromatophores went through several shades rapidly. "That is a significant assumption." "I know," Dara said. "Tell me where the passage point is." "Sergeant Major." "You came to my room at 1:40 and told me about this," Dara said. "You brought us here. You've been here for 5 days with us. You didn't do any of that because you wanted someone to sit on this information." A long pause. Imathi's chromatophores settled into a deep, resonant green that Dara hadn't seen from her before. The passage point, Imathy said, is 14 hours from the station. The conversation with General Holt was not easy. Dara had expected that. She laid out the situation with the same factual precision she always used, and Holt listened the way he always listened, carefully, without interruption, and then he was quiet for a longer time than usual. "You want to go through the rift," he said. "I want to explore the passage point, assess its viability, determine if there's a way to send a probe through safely. I'm not talking about a crewed expedition. I'm talking about reconnaissance. The Velkari have no knowledge of this passage point. Imathy believes their monitoring arrays may have recorded anomalies at that location, but that the data would have been flagged as sensor error and archived. Their models don't include the possibility of a thinning in the membrane, so the readings would have looked like equipment noise." Farrock's confident in her translation of the encoding. As confident as she can be without a second dataset to check against. She's gone over the derivations 4 times. Another silence. "Osai," Holt said. "If something on the other side of the rift is actively reaching out, if this is what it looks like, this is the most significant first contact event in human history." "Yes, sir. And it's reaching out to us because we were the ones paying attention," Dara said. "Or more precisely, because Farrock was the one paying attention, and because Farrock's approach was different from what the Velkari monitoring systems were doing. Not better, necessarily, just different. We're the new variable." "Humanity? Fuck yeah," Holt said, which was not something she had ever heard him say before, and she realized after a moment that he was quoting an old piece of GalacticNet slang that had somehow made it all the way to a general in the UEDC diplomatic corps, which was almost funnier than the situation warranted. "Something like that, sir," she said. "Reconnaissance only," he said. "Probe if you can, document everything, and if anything even vaguely threatening. You'll be the first to know." "I'm going to be the second to know," he said. "You'll be the first, that's the point." They reached the passage point at 600 station time on the 7th day. Imathy piloted. Farrock sat at the sensor console, running readings every 15 minutes and comparing them against her model. Dara sat in the co-pilot's seat and watched the rift. She had seen images of it. Everyone who grew up in the mid-22nd century and paid any attention to the news had seen images of it. But images are flat. They don't capture the quality of looking at a thing that your perceptual apparatus insists on interpreting as depth, even though the concept of depth breaks down at the boundary of the rift. It looked like the universe had a bruise here, or like someone had taken a photograph of space, and then very carefully in one region replaced the depth of field with something that had a completely different theory of distance. It was not dramatic. It was not spectacular. It was wrong, in the specific way that things are wrong when they violate an assumption you didn't know you were making. "Reading the passage point at 300 meters, Farrock said. "The membrane here is okay, so in our model the rift membrane has a characteristic energy density of between 14 and 17 TeV seconds per cubic meter, depending on local conditions. At this point, it's at 4.2. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a statistical variation. Something made this." "Something thinned the membrane from the other side," Imathy said. Her chromatophores were a pale gold, alert, focused. "Maintained it at this level for how long would this require?" "Given the energy required, years," Farrock said. "Something has been expending significant continuous energy to hold this open for us, for however long we take to find it." The implication of that settled over the shuttle like a change in atmospheric pressure. "They've been waiting," Dara said. Nobody responded because it didn't require a response. They deployed a probe, a standard UEDC deep field sensor package, the kind rated for extreme environments, small enough to fit in Dara's palm, and ran a pre-launch check. and Farok spent 20 minutes encoding a greeting message in the same mathematical base as the signal they'd received. Because if something on the other side was paying attention, they should know the probe wasn't hostile. "It's a beautiful irony," Farok said, while she was working. "We're sending math through the rift as our first deliberate communication. Humanity's great first contact message is basically a calculus problem." "What would you send instead?" Dara asked. Farok thought about it. "Music," she said, "but I don't know what kind." "Send both," Dara said. "Encode a sound file, attach it to the probe." "What sound?" "Your choice." Farok looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled up a sound file on her tablet and said, "This is embarrassing." But she attached it anyway, and Dara didn't ask what it was until much later, and by then other things had happened. The probe launch was smooth. They watched it travel the 300 meters to the passage point and begin to cross the membrane, and it went through without the dramatic event any of them had half expected. No flash, no shockwave, nothing cinematic. It simply crossed the threshold and was on the other side, transmitting steadily. The data feed ran for 6 minutes. Then the probe's signal shifted. The encoding changed. Something on the other side was overwriting the data stream, not jamming it, overwriting it. And what came through on the feed was not the probe's sensor readings but a new mathematical signal, more complex than anything they'd received before, dense with information, layered in the way that languages are layered when someone is trying to say more than one thing at the same time. Farok stared at the feed for a very long time. "It's returning the message," she said. "Not our message, a different one, but using our encoding. It learned our encoding from the probe's calibration sequence in 6 minutes." Her voice was perfectly calm, the way voices become perfectly calm when the mind behind them is doing everything it can just to stay upright. "And then it sent us, I think, coordinates. In our encoding, a specific spatial coordinate relative to the passage point." "On our side or their side?" Dara said. "Our side," Farok said. "It gave us a location on our side of the rift." She looked at Dara. "It's telling us where to stand." They came back through the coordinate without knowing quite what to expect, and what they found was not a planet and not a station, and not anything that had a name in the UEDC's catalog of rift-adjacent phenomena. It was a structure. Old and vast and built with a geometry that was fundamentally wrong by any standard they could use to evaluate it, because the geometry reflected a math that was not native to this side of the rift, a logic that had been shipped across the membrane the way a seed ships across water, carried here and planted with enormous and patient effort. It was, in its way, a door. Not through the rift, into the conversation that led to the rift. Dara stood at the observation port and looked at it for a long time. It rotated slowly, or appeared to rotate. It was possible the rotation was a perceptual artifact of trying to apply three-dimensional spatial understanding to something that didn't strictly occupy 3 dimensions. It was roughly the size of a small city. It was made of a material that absorbed light at certain frequencies and emitted it at others, which gave it the appearance of being carved from something that was always slightly more lit than its surroundings. It was impossible. It had clearly been here for a very long time, waiting, the way the signal had been waiting, the way the passage point had been maintained, waiting. "It's a meeting place," Imathi said. She was standing beside Dara. Her chromatophores were cycling slowly through colors Dara didn't have words for. "Something built a meeting place on our side of the rift, because it knew it could not come through the rift to us, and then it waited for us to be ready to find it. The Velkari have been monitoring this region for 6 centuries, Dara said, not as an accusation. She didn't have it in her for an accusation right now. There wasn't room, but as a fact that needed to be said. "We have been looking at the rift," Imathi said. "We have not been looking at what is adjacent to it." She was quiet for a moment. "Ambassador Saravath believes humans are irrelevant to the rift. She believes you are a young species with an exaggerated sense of your own importance in a situation that was being managed before your civilization existed. She's not wrong about our age, Dara said. No, Imathi said, but something built a door to be found, and it calibrated what was on that door using a signal that was only deciphered because a human scientist published a theoretical model that led a human soldier to bring that scientist here. The chromatophore settled, went steady, a color Dara had not seen before and thought she might not see again. Perhaps what was new was what was needed. Dara pressed her forehead against the cold of the observation port, briefly, just for a moment, a human gesture, the way a person grounds themselves against glass when the thing they're looking at is almost too large to hold. She had an image just then of herself as a child in Kumasi, pressing her face against the window of her uncle's car, watching the city go by, pretending she could put herself through the glass and into the world on the other side. She had done that for years before she understood that you don't go through the glass. You go around. You find the door and you open it. She stood up straight. Farrak, she said, can you encode a response? Already started, Farrak called from the sensor console. What are you saying? A pause. I'm saying we found the meeting place, Farrak said, and we're bringing more people. Another pause, and I'm attaching the sound file again. What sound file? Imathi asked. Dara looked over at Farrak. Farrak looked back at her with the expression of someone who has done something that she has decided to own completely. The song, Farrak said. My mother used to sing it. Hafez's poem, Old Persian Melody, she sang it when she was doing the washing up. It's about love of the world, about looking at the world and finding it beautiful even when it is difficult. She looked at the structure beyond the port. I thought, if something has been patient for this long, and has used that patience to build something this large just to have a conversation, I thought it might appreciate being told that we find things beautiful. That we're the kind of creatures that notice beauty. She shrugged, somewhat defensively. It seemed like the right thing to say. Dara was quiet for a moment, then she said, yeah, it does. General Holt received their full report 14 hours later. By then, Saravath had formally requested Imathi's immediate recall through 6 separate official channels, which was enough channels to indicate that she was worried rather than merely annoyed. By then, 3 of the Velkari science dedicants from HEM-7, quiet among them, had independently filed requests to join the second mission to the coordinate. By then, Farrak had stayed awake for 31 hours and had produced 47 pages of mathematical analysis of the structure's geometry and the signal they'd received from it, and had declared, at the end of those 47 pages, that they needed Dr. Venkataraman here immediately, and possibly also a linguist, and probably a musician, and definitely more coffee. Holt's response to the report came in 6 hours after he received it. It was longer than usual. He had forwarded the report to the Secretariat General. He had requested an emergency session of the Unified Council's diplomatic board. He had, he said, called in several favors he had been saving for a different kind of emergency. He had also, he noted, spoken with Ambassador Saravath directly, and had told her what they had found, and had offered the conclave joint access to the coordinate. Not as a concession, not as a bargaining chip, but as a matter of course, because this was not something that could or should belong to any single species. Saravath had, after a long silence, asked a single question. The question was, how did they find it? Holt had said, by looking at something new with new eyes. There was another long silence. Then Saravath said, and he had written this down, he told Dara, because he wanted to have it accurately. Your sergeant major sat across this table and looked at me like she was reading something I didn't know I'd written. I found it irritating. I think I understand it better now. Dara read this part of the message twice. Then she went to the observation port and stood there in the long quiet of the rift's borderland, with the structure rotating slowly below them, and the membrane of the rift glowing at the edge of the visible field with that particular wrong light. And Farrak asleep finally at the sensor console with her tablet clutched to her chest like a child, holds a book they've loved to pieces, and Amathy in the pilot's seat running slow, careful calculations, and Quiet's voice in her memory describing the sound of the pulse. The rhythm, the heartbeat, the reflection of a long and patient attention reaching across an uncrossable distance to say, "I am here. I know you are there. I have made a place for us to meet." She thought about the song, about love of the world. She thought, we are so new to this. We are so new to all of this, and we keep showing up to things we weren't invited to and learning what's being said before anyone thinks to lock the door, and somehow that keeps being exactly what's needed. She didn't say any of this out loud. There was nobody awake to say it to, and also some things you hold in for a while, some things you let settle before you speak them, because the speaking will change the shape of them. But she thought, we are going back. We are going back to that structure, and we are bringing more people, and we are going to have the conversation that something on the far side of a 600-year-old boundary has been trying to have. And whatever is on the other side, whatever patient, ancient, extraordinarily capable thing has been thinning a membrane and building a meeting place and simplifying its language for us, the way you simplify for someone you hope will eventually understand. It is going to find out that we can be just as patient. When we need to be. When it matters. She smiled in the dark of the observation port, with no one watching. It mattered. The message from Earth came while Amathy was asleep, and Farok was still running numbers. It was addressed to Dara directly, routed through the UEDC Diplomatic Corps Secure Relay, and it was not from General Holt. It was from a woman named Admiral Constance Mbeki, whom Dara had met exactly once, at a ceremony 3 years ago where Dara had been decorated for something she still didn't entirely understand the politics of, and who had looked at her across the room with the expression of someone filing away a future usefulness. The message said, "We've been watching the situation develop, Sergeant Major. The Secretariat is convening. Before they do, I need your honest assessment, not the diplomatic version, the version you'd tell a soldier who needed to make a decision." Dara read it twice, then she recorded a reply. "The honest version," she said, "is that something on the far side of the rift has been trying to talk to us for 6 years, and the Velkari systems weren't built to hear it. We heard it because one of our scientists approached the data from a direction nobody had tried before. What's on the other side, I don't know. I can tell you what the structure outside this window implies: patience, intelligence, an understanding of physics that exceeds ours, and a decision to communicate rather than anything else. I can tell you that it responded to Farok's analysis in real time in a way that suggests it can model us cognitively. It understood what she was trying to do and adapted to help her do it. That is either the most benign possible first contact scenario or the most sophisticated possible threat posture. I don't think it's the second one, but I want to be honest. I don't know. What I know is that we have a door and an invitation and a song that cross space in both directions, and that seems like something we walk toward rather than away from." She paused. "End of honest version, Admiral." She sent it and went back to the observation port. The structure was doing something new. Farok had noticed it before falling asleep and had marked it with a flag in the sensor log without quite managing to articulate what it was doing before her brain gave out. Dara studied the sensor log now, cross-referencing against the observation feed, and what she saw was this. At irregular intervals, something in the structure produced a pulse of radiation at the same frequency that had been used to anchor the encoding base, the universal constant frequency, the one that served as a reference measure. It pulsed and then was still. Pulsed and then was still. It was waiting for a response. It was, in fact, doing exactly what the Dedicants described, producing a rhythm, a heartbeat, not from the far side of the rift now, from here. Something had come through. Or part of something had come through. Or a signal had been compressed and fired through the passage point in a form that could operate the structure it had built. the way a program can be transmitted across a distance and then run on whatever hardware is at the other end. Dara sat with this for a long time. The implications stacked themselves in her mind, with the patience of someone who has learned that the implications will be there when she is ready for them. She thought about the Velkari conclave, 600 years of careful maintenance, 600 years of looking at the rift as a thing to be managed rather than a thing that might have something on the other side of it. She thought about the word Saravath had used, charming. What your scientists believe about the rift is charming, said the way you would say it to someone whose opinion you had predismissed. She thought about quiet, pressing metaphorically against the wall, pressing her attention against the boundary, and hearing herself reflected back. She thought, how long have they been waiting for someone to press their ear against the wall? She thought 6 years at minimum, maybe longer, maybe much longer. Maybe they'd tried before, earlier, with signals that had been flagged as instrument error and archived, and they'd adjusted and tried differently and kept adjusting. The way you adjust when you're talking to someone who can't quite hear you, raising your voice, changing your frequency, simplifying your vocabulary, finding the shared constants, finding the language beneath language that consists of nothing but undeniable physical fact. She thought, that's what you do for someone you want to reach. That's what you do when reaching them matters. The structure pulsed. Dara went to the sensor console and pulled up Farrock's encoding tools. She wasn't a scientist. She had no training in xenolinguistics or mathematical encoding, or any of the half-dozen fields that should probably be represented in this moment. What she had was 22 years of understanding how to communicate under difficult conditions, how to establish trust with people who had reason not to trust you, how to signal intent across a gap of language and culture and history. She found the calibration signal in Farrock's tools, the one Farrock had used to anchor the mathematical base. She ran it once, transmitting on the same frequency as the structure's pulse. The structure stopped pulsing. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds. Then the structure pulsed again, twice, on the same frequency as her calibration signal. She ran the calibration signal again, twice. 3 seconds, then 3 pulses from the structure. She sat down at the console, added 1 more pulse to her next transmission, 4 total. 3 seconds, 4 pulses from the structure. What are you doing? Farrock's voice came from behind her, slightly blurred with sleep. Learning the handshake, Dara said. Go back to sleep. Absolutely not, Farrock said, and was at the console beside her in seconds, sleep creased and entirely alert, the way scientists apparently transitioned out of unconsciousness when the thing they cared most about was doing something new. What followed was 4 hours of work that Dara would never be fully able to describe to anyone who hadn't been there. The count exchanges back and forth, like 2 children comparing notes through a fence, gave way to something more complex as the structure began varying not just the number but the interval between pulses, introducing a time signature. Farrock picked up the time signature in the second iteration and began matching it, and then varying it, and the structure matched her variations. They were beyond simple counting now. They were inside something that had the shape of a conversation before the words arrived. They were in the space of gesture and recognition, the space before language, where 2 minds establish that they are both present and paying attention and trying. It was Dara would think about this for the rest of her life, she suspected. It was like the first moment you realize someone you're talking to is genuinely listening, not waiting for their turn, not performing engagement. Actually, carefully, patiently listening. At 3:47 station time, Farrock sat back in her chair and said, "It sent a question." You can tell it was a question. It's complicated, but the encoding has a marker we haven't seen before, and it appears at the end of a message that otherwise follows a conditional structure. Conditionals are how you express questions in a mathematical language. If this, then what? She looked at her tablet. The content of the question is, We have the base unit, we have the time constant, we have the encoding scheme. And then something we haven't mapped yet, and then the conditional marker. It's asking what comes next, Dara said. It's asking what we are, Farrak said, or what we want, or what we're capable of, something in that domain. She shook her head. I need more vocabulary. I don't have the vocabulary yet. You have some, Dara said. You have the math, you have the physical constants, you have HFYs. Farrak looked at her sideways. You said it appreciated knowing we find things beautiful, Dara said. It's a question about what we are. Telling it something true about what we are seems like a reasonable response. Farrak was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled up the song file, the one her mother used to sing doing the washing up. She looked at it for a moment. It was a short file, a home recording, slightly uneven in volume, warm. She played it once, quietly, just the two of them in the near dark of the sensor room, with the structure pulsing softly outside the port, and the rift glowing at the edge of everything, and Imathi asleep in the pilot's seat, and the 3 dedicants of him 7-14 hours back in their grown stone barnacle station, all of them part of a thread that ran from Farrak's tablet and Farrak's mother's voice, and a poem about loving the world. Back to a signal that had been patiently cycling through the boundary of what was thought to be uncrossable, waiting. She attached the file to an encoding packet and transmitted it. They sat with the silence that followed. It lasted 47 seconds. Dara counted them. Then the structure did something neither of them had seen it do before. The pulse stopped. Every reading on the sensor board dropped to background levels. And then, on a frequency they hadn't been monitoring because it hadn't been active before, the sensors caught something that Farrak nearly missed. A signal so faint and so different from everything they'd been working with that it took her 3 passes to confirm it was there. It was not mathematical. It was not structured in any encoding system they recognized. It was, as near as they could determine with the instruments at their disposal, sound. Compressed, encoded in a carrier wave that was technically not a sound wave at all, but when Farrak ran the decompression and played it through the console speakers, it was unmistakably sound. A tone, then 2 tones, then a third, a chord that should not have been possible from a species that had presumably never heard human music and had no framework for the physics of acoustic harmony. A chord built, Dara realized after a moment, from the same intervals as the song. As the HFY's poem her mother had sung, reconstructed from the emotional mathematics of a recording. Something on the other side of the rift had listened to a woman sing while doing the washing up and had understood what it was for, had understood it as a gesture of openness, of beauty finding, and had replied in kind, in its own voice, whatever that meant, in the mode that was native to it, building a harmony out of a melody it had been given. Farrak pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Dara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Outside the port, the structure pulsed once softly and was still. Imathi woke at 500 to find both of them still at the console, and the sensor logs full of the night's work. She read through it in silence, standing, her chromatophores cycling through colors Dara had never seen from her, colors that had no translation equivalent, colors that might not have needed one. When she was done, she said, "The conclave will call this dangerous." "I know," Dara said. "They will say we cannot know the intent. They will say 6 centuries of containment cannot be abandoned based on an exchange of mathematical sequences and music. They're not wrong to be cautious." "No," Imathi agreed, "but they are wrong to believe that caution means stillness. Something has spent 6 years building patience and vocabulary to have this conversation. That is not the behavior of a threat. A threat does not teach you its language first." Dara looked at the sensor log, at the harmonic reply compressed into a carrier wave, at Farrak's decompression and the waveform on the screen, those 3 tones building a chord around a borrowed melody. "I'm going to recommend to General Holt that we request a formal joint mission," she said. UEDC and Velkari Conclave, equal partnership. No exclusion, no hierarchy. Both species, both perspectives, both sets of tools. The ambassador will resist, Imathi said. She'll come around, Dara said. Why are you confident of that? Dara thought about Saravath's words, as Holt had relayed them. Your sergeant major sat across this table and looked at me like she was reading something I didn't know I'd written. She thought about what it meant to be read by someone you decided was irrelevant. She thought about the specific discomfort of being wrong about someone in a direction you didn't expect. Because she's smart, Dara said. And smart people, when they're wrong, eventually need the truth more than they need to have been right. Imathi's chromatophore settled, that deep, resonant green again. The one Dara had started to think of as something like trust. I will file a full report to the Conclave's research division, Imathi said. Not through Saravath, direct. It will cause problems for me. It will cause problems, Dara agreed. It will also cause the right people to know the right things. Yes, Imathi said. That is the same calculation I made the night I came to your door. She paused. I was not certain you were the right variable. I am more certain now. I'm still figuring it out, Dara said. Yes, Imathi said. That is, I think, the point. Outside, the structure pulsed in the steady quiet of space, patient as something that has learned to measure time in the only units that matter, the interval between one conversation and the next. Dara watched it for a moment longer. Then she opened a comm channel to General Holt, recorded what she knew and what she believed and what she thought needed to happen next, and sent it, across the light minutes to where he waited, across the diplomatic machinery and the Velkari bureaucracy and the 600-year-old certainty that some boundaries should stay boundaries, out toward the uncertain future that waits on the other side of every door that has ever been worth opening. She was not gone in a minute. She had barely started,